Can we get the lights and the audience turned down? Or you can get the water now? Or I can get the water. No. I'll tell you when to stop.
Yeah, Ron's out there moving people in.
Okay. Ron Scott?
I didn't see her. He'll be here.
Okay.
Oh, anytime.
The reception at the museum.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah, it will be.
my hour agreement flying out.
Oh, you're kidding me?
Yes.
Oh my God. What's that? Yeah, I'm ready. Ready to go? You ready? Well, good evening. It's great to have you all here tonight. My name is Greg Crawford, and I'm the president of Miami University, and it's great to welcome you all today. We have a very special guest we're honoring tonight and launching his brand new book, and we're so excited. A War Within a War, and it's one of our most famous alumni, Wil Haygood. So let's give him a... So it's an honor for me to introduce Wil. First, he's class of 1976. Anybody out there graduate then? Oh, we got a few. Awesome. And also, if you know Wil, you probably know that he played JV basketball at Miami University, and his most memorable game was against Ball State, where he scored 4 points. Wil left Miami, and he became an acclaimed journalist, both a national and foreign correspondent, and he spent much of his career at the Boston Globe and also the Washington Post. And then everyone knows Wil as a prolific writer. He illuminates the lives of Black Americans and how they lived and where they lived in a time in history, and he brings that all to light. He's written many, many books, and many of you have probably read some of his books. You probably might have read his book about the boxer, Sugar Ray Robinson, about the entertainer, Sammy Davis Jr., about the politician, William Clayton Powell, the butler, Eugene Allen, the justice, Thurgood Marshall, and Tigerland, if you remember that one. It was about a black high school, East High in Columbus, Ohio, during a very turbulent time in this country, where they went on to win the state championship in basketball and baseball that year. They were underdogs. And then colorization. He brought to life black cinema that went all the way back to the silent movie era. Very exciting book that was. And today we're going to do War Within a War about the Vietnam War. So we're just delighted to have Wil back. As I reflected upon tonight, and I was thinking about when I first met Wil, it was really interesting. I took this job 10 years ago, and I didn't quite start yet at Miami. And I got a big box of books from our favorite librarian, Jerome Connolly. And as I paged through these books and was looking through, I see Wil Haygood on the Thurgood Marshall book. And I didn't know Wil was a Miami alum at that time, and I knew, of course, about The Butler. And so I was very excited, and that was really the first book that I read of Wil's. And at that point in time, I couldn't wait to get to Miami to meet with him and to meet him in person. And the first year, I got to meet Wil, and we hit it off. We shared stories, we shared values, and he was just an amazing person and an amazing alum to sit with and talk with. And then it was time for his next book, and that was Tigerland. Very exciting sports story. It was an amazing book. And Wil decided that we'd love to launch it at Miami. And when he came to ask me, I'm like, well, when can we get going? I was so excited to launch that book, and it was amazing. A few stories about that. Wil came to our convocation. We gave 6,000 books out that year. Wil signed every single one of them. Yeah. And he spoke at convocation, and it was just really amazing. But the most important piece of it, it was at the Freedom Summer Memorial, and on the hill with all the students there. And Wil talked about Tigerland and the civil rights era during those wins of the state championships. So it was a really extraordinary experience. And we honored Wil in many different ways. I can't even go through all of them. But one was that day we named the road next to Peabody Hall and across the street from Freedom Summer, Wil Haygood Lane. And then we also awarded him with the President's Medal, and that was very exciting. But the one thing that he liked the most during his visit, and I never could compete with this, but athletics gave Wil a letter jacket. He was so excited, and he told me, he goes, I wish I had this when I was in college. So it was just fantastic, and then we launched colorization. But one memorable moment that I can tell you about with Wil is that Wil and I were in Washington, D.C. together, and we stood shoulder to shoulder, and we awarded the Honorable Congressman John Lewis with the Freedom Summer of '64 award. The room was filled with his colleagues. It was filled with Republicans and Democrats. It was filled with our students at Miami, the Government Relations Network. We had many of the Western College alumni back and many Miami University alumni there. It was a moving moment. And as I sat there and listened to Wil introduce Congressman Lewis, he started with Freedom Summer right here in Oxford, and then on to Selma and the leadership that the congressman did there, and then all the way through his political career. And at that point in time, I was like, wow, can Wil tell a story or what? It was amazing. And so it's just been fantastic, and we're really excited about tonight. So the book, A War Within a War, is about black soldiers, nurses, surgeons, journalists that served in Vietnam. It illuminates their lives at that time, but also they were fighting for a country that didn't treat them equally. And so we're going to learn about that tonight. You're going to hear heroic stories about Captain Riley Leroy Pitts. You're going to hear stories about the picture on the front cover of what you see right there, which is Skip Dunn, a young Marine from Columbus, Ohio. And we love to welcome his widow here tonight. Neva's with us. And on this stage with me, you're going to hear firsthand from Miss Dorothy Harris, an Army nurse in Vietnam. And Dr. Nelson, an Army surgeon in Vietnam. And so as we get started here, I reflect upon my 10 years knowing Wil, and it comes down to three phrases. These three phrases we all hold near and dear to our hearts here at Miami. The first is sturdy-hearted, pure of soul, in our alma mater. That describes Wil. He speaks and he writes with conviction and moral clarity and moral courage, and he brings those stories to life through his storytelling. Prodesse quam conspici, to lead with humility, our motto on our seal. That's Wil. He brings the stories of those people and their life experiences and the history to life that otherwise may be overlooked. And finally, love and honor, and that's Wil for sure. Wil is a Bodway Scholar in residence for many years, and he shares his wisdom and his experience and all his stories with our students, creating a true ripple effect as a faculty member. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Wil Haygood, Miami class of '76.
I still can't believe that I have a varsity letter jacket when I set the bench most of the time. So I stand before you as the most distinguished, undistinguished athlete in the history of Miami University. It is great to be here. I thank you for coming out. Very important time in this nation's history. I feel in my heart and soul for this book. I spent 5 years on it, and it seems to come out at a time when American democracy is under attack, when books are being banned, when the truth is being twisted. So you are here because you believe in American democracy. I've been in war zones, I've seen countries fall, and democracy is nothing to trifle with. As one of the founding fathers once said, it is a republic if you can keep it. I want to say something real quick about the people on this panel. The far end, Miss Dorothy Harris, one of the bravest women I have ever met in my life. There's a statuette emblem on the stage here, and it is a replica of the Women in Vietnam statuette that is in Washington, D.C., where I live. And when I walk past it these days, I think of her. She was there. She heard the bullets, heard the grenades, heard the cannon fire. Next to her sits Dr. Elbert Nelson, born and raised in the segregated state of Georgia. Went to Vietnam and knew once he saw images of the Watts uprising on TV, he knew that the black soldiers would have something to say about being treated fairly. He went to war to heal people. Next person I would like to say just something real quick about is my editor, Peter Gethers. He sits right here close to me. In my book, he is the best nonfiction editor in the United States of America. He has edited luminaries. He has written himself. He has worked in the movie business. With each book I do, I simply try to make him proud of me. And I'm with Alfred A. Knopf, who in the 1920s published black writers when other publishing houses would not. They published many of the writers, such as Langston Hughes, who made a name for themselves during the Harlem Renaissance. Finally, I would like to say something about President Crawford. He believes in literature. He believes in history. He believes in the fate of this nation. He believes in higher education. When I got to the last word of this book, sitting in my writing study at home, I knew who I was going to dedicate this book to. On the dedication page of this book, it says, for Gregory P. Crawford, who understood this mission. Writers, we are engaged in missions. We tell the truth. We try to be as honorable to history as we can. And the reason I said about writing this book is because there was a gap in American letters where this story had not been told. So I'm honored to be a member of the faculty here at Miami University. The students inspire me. About 15 of them were in the room when I signed thousands of books for everyone. Those books are signed, and I thank those students who were with me. We had fun chatting about life here at Miami. For some reason, I often ask them how they are doing in school. 3.5 GPA, 3.8 GPA, 4-point GPA. Quite different from me. I graduated summa cum laude. But I was happy to make it out. Thank you, Miss Neva Dunn, and your family for being here. The family of Skip Dunn, who lived right across the street from me when I was a kid. He waved to me every morning. This cover photograph was not earmarked for the book, but I called Mrs. Dunn after the book had been finished and told her that I was often now thinking of Skip, and I asked her if she could send me a photograph. She sent the photograph to me, and I sent it to my editor in New York. In the 11th hour, and my editor showed it to the art director, and they said, wow, look at his eyes. Those eyes speak to America. They seem to be asking America, why are we in Vietnam? What is this war really about? We're going to show you a quick clip of a soldier named Riley Pitts, who the president had mentioned. This footage was found just about 7 months ago. It was lost footage. Riley Pitts was a great hero. He was in his camp one day. Actually, they were out in the bush, and a grenade was thrown at his feet. So, of course, he and his 12 men would die at that moment. They were dead. Riley Pitts fell on the grenade. He had killed himself to save his men. And the grenade malfunctioned. It didn't go off. His men were crying and screaming, and they couldn't stop telling him, as soon as we get back to base camp, we're going to put you in for the Medal of Honor. 2 days later, Pitts stood up outside of his tent, and he got hit with shrapnel in his head, and he died on the spot. Lyndon Johnson, the architect of so much of this war, invited Riley Pitts' family to the White House, and he did get the Medal of Honor. The footage you are getting ready to see is footage when Riley Pitts was in Vietnam, and he was talking about the racial situation. As I've written in the book, white couldn't survive without black in Vietnam, and black couldn't survive without white. So we're going to show you the footage, which his two small children, this was the first time they heard their father's voice when this footage was discovered.
Memorial Day, as we honor the brave souls who died fighting for our country in the name of freedom, we remember one particular hero's family, the Pitts family from Oklahoma City. Though not related to my Nightline co-anchor Byron Pitts, he traveled to meet them to share a special memory. Tonight, 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, we bring you a story of courage, bravery, love, and the son who didn't remember the sound of his father's voice until now.
Get that, Mom?
Tell me what this picture is.
He was in, boy, he's a good looking guy. Look at that. Hollywood. Look at that, Mom.
To the American people, Captain Riley Leroy Pitts is a hero. A soldier who gave his life fighting in Vietnam.
We married the next year.
But his loved ones, wife Eula May, son Mark, and daughter Stacy, know the harsh and high price of that heroism.
Yep.
What do we have here?
This is the Medal of Honor.
These other medals, what are these?
2 Purple Hearts, 1 Silver Star.
And you know, they don't give these things out for free.
No, they don't.
No, they don't. They cost.
They cost.
Yeah. Or I was.
War cost their family everything. Their father's voice silenced nearly 6 decades ago when they were too young to remember. But a moment on this day will change everything. Never before seen unearthed video of their father weeks before his death that they're going to see for the very first time.
Base of operations.
I'm seeing more than I expected, and I don't know that I was quite hungry for that much. I told you what.
Let's talk about Captain Riley Leroy Pitts. The last time you saw your father, you were 3 and you were 5.
Yep.
What do you remember?
My overwhelming sense is him always on the floor playing with us. That's what I remember most. And a deep booming laugh. That's what I remember. I don't remember much else.
I don't remember what his voice sounds like. My memories of him are through the family.
Those family memories paint a picture of a tall, strapping, and motivated young man. So how would you describe your brother?
He was a very good person. He would interact with everybody.
And you? So tell me about this tall, handsome drink of water you married.
Well, he was tall and handsome.
Why did you love him?
You know, he was such an easy person to love. He was very warm and very open. He was very friendly.
Friendly and accomplished. Bachelor's degree, Wichita State, fluent in 2 languages. Left a job at Boeing to serve his country as an Army officer. In the 1950s, to be a black man in college, when less than 10% of Americans were college educated, less than 3% of black people had a college degree, but yet this man.
The nurse on this stage served with Captain Riley Pitts.
Well, we're very excited to have you all here, but first and foremost, I wanted to thank Ms. Dorothy Harris and Dr. Nelson for your service to our country.
Thank you.
And if we will, those in the audience that are veterans, those that are currently serving, and maybe our ROTC cadets and midshipmen, would you please stand to be recognized? The first question is for you, Wil. So the Captain Pitts story was compelling. And one of the elements in your book, and also on some of the footage that was found, was just how much those soldiers respected him. And can you sort of expand upon that a little bit, why you think it was, and through his personality, how he drew those soldiers in with so much respect? And tell us more about that story of Captain Pitts.
Yes. First of all, he worked in public relations in Saigon. And the more he saw of the war, the more he had his own dreams. He kept telling Nurse Harris that he wanted to rise up in the ranks. He wanted to be a general. Of course, there weren't very many black generals, so he set the bar very high for himself. And that's why he joined this outfit known as the Wolfhounds. They were one of the toughest, meanest group of U.S. soldiers. They went off into the bush to hunt and kill. Nurse Harris tried to talk him out of doing that. She said, Riley, why do you want to go out there into the bush? As he was passing her daily drink of a 5-cent Coca-Cola. And he told her, he said, I'd like to make my family proud, I'd like to make my country proud, and I'd like to make myself proud. And his men would hear that. And so he joined the Wolfhounds, the tough unit, and that cost him his life. And I think that his men admired him and grew to love him, even though they were out there a short period of time. They saw with their own eyes that he was ready to give up his life so that they could live. It was just a miracle of fate that hand grenade didn't go off. It was just a sheer miracle of fate. And so when I first found Miss Harris and was talking to her, she was the one who asked me, "Have you ever heard of Riley Leroy Pitts?" And I said, "No, who's that?" And so she explained it to me, and I knew that the story was so compelling that I had to track down Riley Pitts' widow, Miss Eula Pitts, and I did. And I interviewed her, and one of the things that was so poignant that she said to me, she said, "Will, all of the medals and the recognition are fine, are lovely, but we'd actually rather have our Leroy back."
There you go. Miss Harris, you went to Vietnam as an Army nurse, and we read all about you in the book. And tell us about first why you wanted to be a nurse in the Army. And at that time, you probably knew what was going to happen, that you'd be going to Vietnam. And then maybe tell us a little bit about the lessons learned, what you learned in Vietnam, what you saw, and maybe if you can share some of your stories with us.
Okay, since I was 8 years old, I decided I wanted to be a nurse. One of my aunts bought me a medical kit, and I was practicing on my family. And I said, "This is what I want to do." And I like people, and I wanted to treat them. My experience in NUM was good and bad, okay? I have to say that because of NUM, it's who I am today. The experience of seeing these young soldiers and their injuries was horrifying. In fact, when I came back to the States, one of the guys that worked, I was an industrial nurse at the time, and they were telling me about a relative of theirs that had died in Vietnam. I didn't want to tell him that, "Oh, sorry, I thought this was off. I didn't want to tell him that I saw his cousin actually die.
Oh.
I couldn't tell him that. But one of the things I learned in Vietnam is that whatever we can do to have peace and not war, that's what we should do, no matter what the cost is. So that's my story.
Thank you. And Dr. Nelson, very few black surgeons in Vietnam. And I know from the book that you spent a lot of time with a lot of soldiers and talking with them. And they shared the challenges that they face both in the bush but also back home, not being treated as an equal and accepted by their country they were fighting for. Can you share some of those conversations or some of those memories with us on those conversations of those young men?
Well, let me begin by saying this. I was 28 years old when I went to Vietnam, and my outlook on life was quite different from the 18 and the 19 and the 20-year-old men. But I basically identified with them. on the base, in the rear. That's who I fraternized with. So I spent all of my relaxing time with the grunts. And it was a lot of fun. So I became one of them. There were two very distinct differences between soldiers. We had soldiers from all over the country, north, south, east, and west. But they all brought their cultures with them. The southern soldier was quite different from the northern soldier. The Midwest soldier was quite different from the southern soldier. The West Coast men who served were quite different from the South. So basically you had these three competing cultures with the Southern culture. But it doesn't mean that some of the people in the North did not have the Southern attitudes. The biggest problem with the young men that I saw was they didn't want to be in Vietnam. After serving with this infantry battalion for 4 months, I was moved to the rear. And there I saw all of the incoming new people coming into Vietnam. We called it coming in country. And I was amazed that some of the boys, and they were boys, would get off that plane. As soon as they landed, they would do something to prevent them from being assigned to a combat unit or any other unit. They would disobey orders. They would not follow rules and regulations. The only thing that they wanted was to, and I can remember on multiple occasions, all I want is my DD, my dishonorable discharge, or my BCD, my bad conduct discharge, and let me go home. So anything that they could think of to do that would result in a DD, they did it. So that was one of the things, and you try to talk them out of it. And if you read a little bit about the book, I used the language that they used, because if I didn't use the language common to the young soldier, that sort of decreased my credibility. So I always use the same language, the same tone that they used. And I was very mindful of some of the things that would occur with officers if they disagreed with the young troops. And I would tell them unequivocally that, this is not my war. And as the war was sometimes called the white man's war, and I would tell them to go ahead and do what you're supposed to do. And after you do it, be happy, but you have to do it. Not because I say do it, but because you have to follow the rules. I would tell them that the Army is not a democratic institution. You have to follow orders. So it worked most of the time, but a lot of times it did not.
Thank you. So Peter, this is the 6th book you edited for Wil.
Yes.
Yeah, so you know him well. I can tell when you guys sat at dinner that you knew each other very well. You needle each other quite a bit.
Well, one of the things about being an editor with an author over a long-term relationship is there's got to be a certain mind meld. So we have to know how the other person thinks. I have to know how he thinks, because I have to know how he's going to work.
So you know him well. So tell us, what makes Wil Haygood so unique as an author?
Oh, there are many things. One, does talk a lot about the 4 points he scored in that basketball game.
That's it.
But really what makes him unique, he is one of the few authors I've ever worked with who doesn't just look at a subject, whether it's Vietnam or the people who he's writing about in the Vietnam book, or whether it's the history of black cinema, or whether it's Sammy Davis or Sugar Ray Robinson. What Wil does that is unique is he takes individuals or concepts and tells those stories, but he puts everything in an historical and sociological context. So you don't just see what's happening, you understand why it's happening and the importance of the event or the person that you're reading about. And that's the way he thinks, and that's the way he writes.
That's great. I'm going to do a multiple choice question for you since you know Wil so well.
Uh-oh.
And I'm going to start with the answers.
Okay.
A, fun. B, insightful. C, challenging. D, inspiring. E, quirky. Or F, all of the above. So the question is, how is it to edit such a famous author that we all love here at Miami University?
Nightmarish. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say that out loud? No, look, it's wonderful to work with someone like Wil. I will say, the best thing about working with Wil, the line editing after he's finished, the discussions of the book, that's all great and professional and fun and quirky and all of the things that not really nightmarish at all. The most fun and interesting thing about working with Wil is when he comes up with the idea, and he usually comes up to New York and we have lunch or dinner, and we just talk about what is the book going to be. And it's never the same book at the end of the meal that it started out to be at the beginning of the meal.
That's true.
Partly because of my input, mostly because Wil's brain starts working as we're talking, and it goes, oh my gosh, that's a great idea, and then he takes my suggestion and turns it into something much better than my suggestion. So that's the most interesting part of working with Wil, is with the Vietnam book, which he said to somebody earlier, when we first had the discussion of what it was going to be, and I said, well, you are leaving one thing out. There have to be women in this book because women were a part of Vietnam. And of course, Wil took that and then found women like Ms. Harris and other people that I didn't even dream he could have come up with. So that's the most exciting part.
That's great. Nightmarish, huh? He knows a different Wil than I do.
Yeah.
So Wil, we look at this cover. The young Marine Skip Dunn, and Neva, his widow's here tonight. But what took me about this book cover was whoever you ask describes that picture in different ways. That face, the eyes, the helmet, etc. You knew Skip. He was in your neighborhood. So tell us a little bit more about Skip and also how it was to write about somebody who you knew that lived in your own neighborhood that became a big part of this book.
Okay. It's 1967. It's the summertime. I live at 1343 North Fifth Street in Columbus, Ohio. Every morning, I walk down off my porch with my red Schwinn bicycle, and there's a guy directly across the street. He always comes down off of his porch around the same time, and he says, "Hey, Wil, how you doing?" And I say, "Hey, Skip, how you doing?" It's Skip Dunn, and he was a neighborhood athlete. He was a basketball star. He was a football star at North High School. And if you're a young kid and your father doesn't live in the house with you, and mine didn't, you look for male heroes, figures in the neighborhood. And Skip taught me how to throw horseshoes. He played softball with me, and I was younger, but he paid attention to me. And he was just a sweetheart of a guy. I mean, all the people who I have met with him, who knew him, who I have met with, and they rave about Skip Dunn. So the book was finished. I had handed the book in to my editor, and he had edited it, and it was all finished. And one night, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I said to myself, whatever happened to Skip Dunn? Because my family moved away from North 5th Street the following spring. And I woke up, it was almost in a cold sweat, thinking about Skip Dunn. So I made a phone call to some people who knew the family, and they told me that Skip had passed away at the age of 45. And I didn't know that. And so I felt sad that I wouldn't get a chance to see him again. And I'm on the phone talking to Mrs. Dunn, and before I hung up, I said, is there any way you can send me a photograph of Skip for sentimental reasons? And I'm very sorry that since the book is finished, I won't be able to fit Skip into the book. And she said, oh, sure, Will. I'll send you a photograph. And 2 or 3 days later, she went up into an attic someplace, as she said, and she found this photograph, and she sent it to me. And when I saw it, I said, whoa, wow. I mean, it seemed to say so much. You know, it has all kinds of texture. It seems to say what Marvin Gaye said about the Vietnam War. You know, the great singer Marvin Gaye had a seminal song out about the Vietnam War, and it was called What's Going On? And it went something like this. Oh, what's going on? Brother, brother, there's too many of you dying. War is not the answer, only peace must find a way. You got to find a way to bring some love in here today. I am the un-Marvin Marvin Gaye. And so I smartly, immediately, within 10 minutes, sent the photograph to my editor up in New York. Now the book is finished. And my editor says to me, 2 or 3 days later, he said, hey, I know the book's finished, and you mentioned Skip in the acknowledgments, but he's not in the book. And my editor, this was truly brilliant, if you ask me, which is why I think he's the greatest nonfiction editor in the country. He said, Will, you need to go back into the book. You need to open this book, the narrative, with you and Skip Dunn in North 5th Street, because there were 5 other guys on North 5th and North 6th Street, young black guys who went to Vietnam. Larry Wilson, Charlie Bolden, Jimmy Bolden, Robert Morris, Steve Collins, and Skip Dunn. I carried papers to each one of their homes. Peter talked to the art director and said, this photograph is important. Maybe you can ask him about that, how that process went. But about 2 months later, Peter, I think maybe you all sent me the first version of the book jacket, and The bottom third, the final third of the book jacket is a scene in Birmingham, Alabama. And my mother and my grandparents are from Selma, Alabama. So that, the top and the bottom of that photograph seemed to say everything that I thought that this book was going to be about. This book was going to be about the war within a war, the battle for inequality and freedom. 55% of the people sent to the front lines in the early years of the Vietnam War were young black men. When blacks made up only 10% of the American population. So that meant that the white officers wanted to sacrifice the black troops more often than anybody else. And so it is little wonder that they rebelled in Vietnam.
Thank you. Ms. Nelson, so decades later, after Vietnam, you're still involved with veterans and you're still attending the veterans meeting. Can you tell us some of the conversations that you have or you're hearing or some of the discussions that you're having in the most recent meetings?
Who is this for, Ms. Harris or
Yes.
Dr. Nelson?
Oh, Ms. Harris. Yeah.
Ms. Harris, okay.
Oh, I'm with the Vietnam Veterans of America. Dr. Nelson is also.
Yeah.
And we meet and we give an event 3 times a year to the community. And we're more interested in reaching out and helping the veterans in any way we can. Just recently, I started looking at not only the veterans themselves, but their spouses, the surviving spouses, because I have some widows in my church. And I talked to the guys about, hey, how about some of the widows? And so they're looking at doing that. But at our meetings, we mostly talk about what we can do to help the community. How can we help the veterans that are homeless and that type thing? We really don't, and then of course we have every branch of the service in that organization. We have Marines, Air Force, Navy, Army, and lots of times the guys are talking about who's the best. And we have one that's a Marine, and he's unreal. He says he's the best, and Marines are perfect. And I have a minister in that community, and he was a Marine. And I told him what this one Marine said. He said, he's right. But not unfortunately, but I have to tell you that this Marine is a very smart guy, intelligent, and most of the time when he tells you something, it's right. So I have to go along with that.
Do you see differences between those that served in Vietnam during the generation that when you were there versus the younger veterans today?
I must say that before I retired from the military, there was a lot of first sergeants that were getting out because the discipline is not there like it used to be. It used to be if you say, go up the hill, you go up the hill. Now they say, why am I going up to the hill? So there's questions, and that's not something that they're used to. So they're retiring versus staying in.
Thank you. Dr. Nelson, the Vietnam War was framed as fighting communism. And when you reflect upon the way that war was framed in the context of contemporary world that we live in today with the modern conflicts, is there anything that comes to mind when you look back nearly 60 years versus the conflicts of today?
I don't think so, because for this reason, when when you are conscripted or you volunteer, you only think of doing your duty. That's foremost in your mind. And regardless of how you feel about it, you must do your duty. If you don't do that, then the whole thing collapses. I never saw during my time even with the Combat Infantry Battalion, where there was an absolute refusal to do your duty. And I can't speak to what happens now, but what I can say, regardless of how you felt, once you were in that unit, out in the bush, or on a fire base, it was just one brotherhood. That's all it was. And you can do your dapping while you're on your fire base, it's fine. And everyone had that type of relationship. So I didn't see any issues. You know, when you're being shot at, ambushed, mortars, rockets, you don't have time to think about anything but survival and helping your fellow brother. And that's what I saw. Now, I don't know too many of the young people who are in our Chapter 10, so I can't speak to how they feel about this, but that's my take.
Mm-hmm. And as a surgeon, saving lives and comforting others and so forth during the war, can you tell us about how you kept doing it? Day in and day out, seeing the tragedy and the loss of life?
Well, initially you are fearful. You become, although you're not a combatant, you do become combat hardened being in that environment. Rockets and mortars don't respect anywhere. You know, they don't respect where you're located. You do it for multiple reasons. One, if you don't, your fighting unit is not going to be capable of doing what they are supposed to do. You have to have good morale. And that's one of the things that we docs knew. You know, if they know you're there, being 28 years old, I wanted to see what the real war was like. I did not have to go out to a fire base, but I did it because I wanted to see what the 18, 19-year-olds were doing out in the field, just near Cambodia. You heard about the place, you read about it, you watched it on television. I wanted to live it to a certain extent. So you just do it. You're trained to do it. Casualties come in, you do what it takes to make them better or get them well or at least survive to the next hospital. So you just do it. I guess that's what you're born to do. That's what you swore to do. So you just do the job. So I would say, do your duty, and the rest takes care of itself.
Ms. Harris, a similar question, working with so many young soldiers, injured and hurt and so forth. You must have many memories about some of those soldier stories and their healing process, and knowing that some may never walk again. Can you tell us how you did your job day in and day out with so much hurt and tragedy?
I didn't really escape because I came back with PTSD. The memories, I had a lot of nightmares when I got back home. Mm-hmm. It was sad to see the young, because they were like Dr. Nelson said, 18, 19 years old. And you know their life has changed forever. I would see the fear in their eyes when they came in as patients. And some of them, I think, knew they were dying, and it was very difficult to take care of those patients. We try to be, I would say, as caring as possible and not show what we really felt when we see the wounds they had, because they were horrific. And like, for instance, for Leroy, I didn't see him die, but I remember I had a dream about him about a week before he died. And I dreamed that something bad was going to happen. And I really made no effort to contact his company, say, be careful, not that there was anything that's going to change. Leroy died on the day he was to come back into the base. It was his last night in the field.
Yeah.
And we all went to his, officers had clubs, and we all go to their clubs at times. And we expected to see him come in, because he was a very good friend of ours. And when we went to the club, it was on a Halloween night. We were all in costumes. For some reason, I didn't know why at the time, but as soon as we got into the club, our chaplain said, "You have to go back to your quarters." And we didn't know why. We went back to our quarters, and that's when they told us that Leroy was killed. And that really shook me up. All of us, really.
Thank you. So, Peter, the book, it's out now. You've known Wil for a long time. What is your hope for this book?
Well, some of my hopes for the book have already been fulfilled. I don't know how many people have seen it, but arguably the best reviews so far of Wil's book writing career. I can say he always gets good reviews. These have been spectacular. There was an astonishing review in the New York Times that recognized exactly how important this book was. That's the first mainstream review that's been public. There were industry reviews, a place called Booklist, which also not only recognized the superb quality of the book, but also pointed out something that is one of my hopes for the book, that we're living in a time, people have talked about democracy being under threat, but we're living in a time where Black excellence is being buried and that history is being distorted, I'll say lied about. So one of the reasons that this book is important is it delves into the truth and is a refutation of that burying of Black history. For instance, Wil's book, a relatively benign book in the scheme of things, colorization about the history of Black cinema, has been banned on military bases by Pete Hegseth, along with several hundred other Black history books. So one of my hopes for this book is that's a fight back against the burying of an important, truthful history. And I think that is going to happen, and it's one of the reasons I think the book is going to do particularly well, because people are angry about that, and here's a book they can turn to uplift them in a way.
Wil, as Peter mentioned, just some amazing reviews on the book. The New York Times, The Guardian, just fantastic.
Yeah.
I know this is probably an inappropriate question for an author, but is this your best book?
Yeah, you know, I sincerely don't know that, but I do think and know, I do know it's my most timely. It's my most timely book, and I put 4.5 years into it. And I think I'll, simply let the New York Times speak for me. Why not?
Well, we want to thank everybody for sharing this evening with us tonight. And I would love to thank our guests on the stage. So, Ms. Harris, thank you for your service and being with us tonight.
Appreciate that.
Dr. Nelson, thank you for your service. It's great to have you here tonight. And Peter, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you. And this is just going to be an outstanding book for our country as we move forward.
And can I just say, I do also edit fiction.
Okay. So, Wil, thank you so much. We're so proud of all of your accomplishments, and we're grateful for what you do and come back every spring to teach our students. The stories that you share, the experience that you give them through your lens is just amazing, and it's really a special gift that we have here in Miami. So if you haven't gotten them already, we have books for everybody, and Wil has signed them all for all of you. And so we're grateful for all that hard work last night. I know you stayed up late. But I wanted to mention that the books are coming to all of you through the generosity of several alums. First, Richard Smucker, class of 70, who made a generous gift. And also, our local alums right here in town, Lee and Rosemary Fisher, who give their generosity so we can make those books happen. So let's give them a round of applause.
I will be outside in the lobby to personalize books.
And Wil is going to be outside as long as it takes to meet with everybody and say hello and also talk about the book. So we will see all of you in the lobby. And again, we're grateful for you spending this special evening with all of us. Thank you.